Well, you want to get into the Word a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I had something that's been going through my mind just over this week, or maybe a week and a half. I went to I had a men's retreat a couple weekends ago, and several people had a different devotional during the men's retreat. And this one guy talked about the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt, and they were caught between the Red Sea and they were caught between Pharaoh. And so he was talking about, they were afraid, and Moses said, "Be still, watch the salvation of the Lord." But then he went around and he said, "What are you afraid of God not doing in your life? Maybe not helping you, or not bringing deliverance, or whatever it is." And so they were going around, each person had to say something, and there's one particular person that's always very quiet, and so I kept kind of coming back to him. And finally when he shared, he said, "It's not so much that I'm afraid that God can't or won't do something, as much as I am that he won't do something because of me. Because of my life, because of what I've done, because of things in my life." And since I know this person, I know that I've known them for a long time, and they've loved the Lord. They've had their ups and downs, but they're incredibly loving, incredibly caring. I remember hearing that, just thinking about how so often so many of us, are carrying things with us, and we feel like sometimes that God won't do what He'll do for others because I know myself better than other people do. And that somehow that's a wall from God, from expecting God to answer my prayers. That would be it. From the anticipation and the expectation that God will hear me because something accuses me of somewhere I've been, or something I've done, or something I've been a part of. And that always becomes this ball and chain that keeps me on the outer realm of faith. And so, as I thought about that, and just thought about even more as believers, making peace with our past. And I think one of the starting places, of course we know the Roman road, Romans chapter 6, verse 23, it says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." And we read over that, and we've heard it all of our lives if you've grown up in church. But the reality of that is that every one of us have been touched by the tragedy of sin. Some maybe have walked in a longer period of time, but we've all been touched. The wages of sin is death. There's not a small sin and a big sin. The consequences and the penalty of it is death working in us. And it's affected all of our lives because we were born into this world. And even in some ways, the ramifications of our choices and decisions have affected other people. And not one of us is immune to that. And I really think that if we could, I tell this to the guys in prison all the time, if we could just grab hold of that one truth, it really removes inferiority in our lives. Because we're all starting at the same place. No matter whether you wear a suit and tie, stand behind a pulpit, whether you work here or do that, or you're President of the United States, we've all been touched by it, we've all been affected by it, and because of our sins, other people have, and the wages are the same. The wages of sin is death. And even Paul, no matter how much of a Pharisee he was, how religious he was, how respected in the temple he was, when he got a glimpse of God, he was able to say, "I'm the chiefest of sinners." And until we're really able to say that about our own life, we'll always be critical of someone else who we don't deem as bad as we are. And think about the Pharisees when they came, they caught a woman caught in the very act. It wasn't just the idea we've heard about, she was caught, and they threw her down, and they had the stones ready. And the only one who had the right to stone her asked her. And I think this is interesting too. He said, "Where are your accusers?" And she said, "Now, this is the part that I've been thinking about lately. There are none." Which tells me, even in his eyes, the one who had the right to condemn her, he didn't see an accusation. As holy and as perfect and without sin there wasn't an accusation in him against her. And he said, "You're forgiven. Go and sin no more." So, the starting point is realizing the depth that we're in. Ezekiel 16, I'll hit a lot of different passages, but I really like this passage when I think of it in relationship to my own life. Because, to be honest with you, from a worldly or a secular maybe standpoint or something, you know, I came to the Lord in high school, really. And it's not that I haven't murdered, there's a lot of things I haven't done in life because I came to the Lord early, you know. And yet, in that place of coming to the Lord, I knew this about myself at that point in my life. I knew that I was hopeless unless God intervened, reached out His hand, and lifted me up out of the pit of destruction. I knew that I was undone and that if God was to judge me of hell, that was a worthy and just judgment. I knew that His penalty on my life was right. And in crying out to Him, He met me in that place. And when I think of that, I think of Ezekiel 16. And he says in verse 6, and this is basically Ezekiel showing him a picture of the children of Israel. It's a vision, and he shows him this. He says in verse 6, so he says, when I passed by you, I saw you squirming in your own blood. And I said to you while you were in your own blood, live. I said to you while you were in your own blood, live. And think about that. You know, when God says to you, live, you no longer have to get anybody else to vote on it. You know, you don't have to ask questions. Am I saved? You know, there's that place. Now listen, there's a place of seeking, of crying out, but there's a place where God says in each one of our lives, in His own way, in His own personal way that becomes real to you, live. And I didn't necessarily hear the word live, but that's what happened in my heart when Christ became real. You know, and when that happens, no matter where you go from that place, sin will never have the same taste. It just won't. But so anyway, you know, he says live. Well, the first point is we've all been touched by it. He has to speak to our life and cause life to break forth within us. But then the second part is Colossians chapter 2. And it is the forgiveness of these sins. And we're going to look at several necessary components to moving on from our past. Colossians 2. And I'm just going to start in verse, the whole chapter is just over the top. But verse 6, as you therefore have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in Him, having been firmly rooted and now being built up in Him and established in your faith, just as you were instructed and overflowing with gratitude. Excuse me. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the traditions of men, according to the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ. For in Him all the fullness of the deity dwells in bodily form. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this. In Him all the fullness of the Godhead dwelt in bodily form. That answers the deity of Christ.
Yes.
In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. 2 Corinthians 5, it says God was in Christ, reconciled. He's not just a good person. He's not just a prophet. Listen, it's amazing to me. I went on a mission trip. This was the one I went to in Nepal, and with a group of believers. And as we walked through a Hindu festival, we stopped at this coffee shop, and there was the worship of idols and all this other stuff. We were sitting there, and the basic agreement of everyone there is that, you know what, everybody's walking in the life that they have. And I'm going, huh? And I remember you have to ask Rebecca, I was struggling. What? And I remember we got back to the place, and I told her we'd gone on a walk, and I said, I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just not going to say anything. Maybe it's me. And I remember we were all sitting together, and I just couldn't. I said, I have to ask you a question. This is what I heard. And everybody was just verifying that. And I remember saying, why did Thomas become a martyr in India? If it all leads to the same place.
Yeah.
You know, if all like, listen, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There's only one sacrifice for sin. And so anyway, moving on from that, I don't spend much time there. Verse 10. And in him you have been made complete. And he is the head over all rule and authority. And in him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And when you were dead in your transgressions and sin, and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven you 90% of your transgressions.
Yeah.
Most of your transgressions. Really all of them except the really bad, dark ones. Now think about that. And again, to me, my seminary changes it's in prison. Because what God does, and I think you'll find this a lot of times in your life, he shows you the obvious so you can discern the more subtle.
Yeah.
And prison to me is a place of obvious things.
Yeah.
And one guy one time came up to me and he said, Andy, what do you do if you won't receive the forgiveness of God? In my mind, what I was hearing is, you know, it's hard to receive the forgiveness of God. And I said, well, you just, you know, go through all the, you got to trust. That's what the Scripture says. No, he said, you don't understand me. I won't receive it. I said, what do you mean you won't receive it? And he says, well, there's no way I can even tell you what I've done. And he said, I'm ashamed of my own life. He said, what I have done to others is beyond forgiveness. Now listen, this is a person who's been through the faith-based dorm. It's a person who's been through the prison seminary. He's got all the certificates on his wall of what the Scriptures mean. But he says, I won't receive God's forgiveness because I'm not worthy. There are things that I have done to myself and to people that count me unworthy of his forgiveness. Now what's interesting in a similar way in our lives, so often we can believe God to forgive other people. Matter of fact, no matter what you've done, you can say, listen, God can meet you there. He's able. But there are places in our own personal life that it keeps us on the outskirts of faith. Because there's an accuser that constantly stands there. The Scripture speaks of it. And when Jesus defined the accuser, he said he's the father of lies. There's no truth in him. Therefore, the only power he has is the credibility we give him. By believing it. Listen, a lie has no... But when you believe it in your heart, it controls the rest of your life. So what is... Now listen. What is that one thing that you would never want displayed upon this wall for all of us to see? Maybe not even an action. It might be a thought that continues to be in there. And the accuser stands there and reminds you of it day after day. You don't have a right to pray. You can't expect God to do things in your life because of this or because of that. Now the Word says He has forgiven us all of our transgression. All means all. Alright? Then think about the next part. He says in verse 14, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, and which was hostile to us, and He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Now think about this. It's harder, I think, for us to conceptualize that, or maybe in light of maybe men that have gone to prison. One of the great fears of men in prison is, when I get out, I carry with me a record. I try to get a job, and people see what I've done. I try to buy a house, and people see this. I try to move into a neighborhood, everybody knows who I am. You know, there are things that you carry with you, and there are fears that how am I going to move on in my life? Because they carry a decree that accuses them. And like I said, seeing the obvious, I remember one time, the guys, they have to go back and get counted over and over again. And so they were going back and get counted. There was one guy with a little walker, and the guard said, "Inmate, get back here." And as he was walking by, he said, you know, "My name's Bob whoever." And the guy says, "Your name is inmate. It's always going to be." And of course, he was, you know, upset. "I can't be a back of line." But you know, they carry something over and over again that says, "You are the worst. You are this." In the same way, what he's saying there's a decree that wants to follow us and say, "You are what you are. And you shouldn't expect anything more because of this right here." And he says, I took that, and it says, and I like this word, it says it was hostile to you. Anybody ever added, I don't even have to ask, anybody have that accusation that has been hostile against you? And he says, I nailed it to the cross. I put it there. Now, coming back to the first point, when Jesus met the woman at the well, he says to her, "Go ask your husband." "Well, I don't have a husband." "Well, I know you've got five. You've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with right now is the husband." Listen, our part is coming to the light. It's not just he forgives you. You don't. No, you got to come to the light. You got to say, "Listen, I've got to face my sin." Kind of the word we use now is I've got to own it. I've got to say, "Yes, that was me." And that's where he had to bring her to the place. And she says, "Wow, you know everything about me." "I do." "So you might as well step out and go on it.
Yeah.
Because it's okay. I'm not going to accuse you. I'm here to heal you, to deliver you, to make you whole." Which leads us to our next part in Joel chapter 2. Joel. Now, if you read the whole thing, it's the children of Israel, starting in chapter 1, and even in Ezekiel 16, we were talking about that, God was actually reminding them, remember where I brought you from. Because they had, once the blessings had come into their life, they had detoured. They began to worship the stuff they had rather than the God who gave it to them. Well, same thing in Joel. He says, "You've departed from my ways. You've begun to worship other things, the gods of this world, the things of this world. And because of that, I've allowed judgment to come into your life." And you know what? One of the things I've learned in my own personal journey, and this has helped me. I was even reading Proverbs today, and it says, "The one who can't hear instruction and correction will veer from the way of life." Listen, receiving correction is absolutely important, but the difficulty is we've learned to receive ways of life. Correction is rejection. You know, I remember when I first got, my dad, when he got to come out, we're running across, and he's doing this, and I'm screaming along. But you know, we learned to receive correction as rejection. He did the best he could with where he was at and what he meant. But God never disciplines us out of his anger. It's always to teach us right. And so, he's never saying shame on you. And once I can learn that, it's easier for me to come into the light. He already knows what's in my heart. And most often, he's allowed the circumstances and situations for me to see it. Because he wants to bring about the change. So in Ezekiel, in Joel, he begins to tell them this, and he talks about rending your heart, not your garments. I'm looking at Joel. Let me find Joel. Where is Joel?
Hosea, Joel, Amos.
Hosea.
My Bible at 732.
Oh, it's before me.
Close to the end.
There we go. Joel chapter 2 and verse 13.
Do you need glasses, honey?
Yes.
Shall I go get you?
No.
There we go.
You'll hang on just a little bit longer.
Wait a second. Well, so what you're doing, right?
Oh,
Joel
yeah,
24. It says, so he talks about earlier, rending your heart, your garments, but then he says near the end, verse 24, he says, And the threshing floors will be full of grain. He's talking about once repentance has happened, once we come to the light, once we allow God to rend our hearts, and the vats will overflow with new wine and oil, then I will make up to you for the years that the swarming locusts have eaten, the creeping locusts and the stripping locusts and the gnawing locusts, my great army which I sent amongst you. Now think about this. I'm not going to this much, but it says he sent the army. You know, he allowed the things to happen. And sometimes we get in that place and we're willing to say, God, forgive me for what I've done. But then the process, God says, not only do I want to forgive you, I want to heal, make whole, and restore. And here's something I watched happen, which I always think is a beautiful story. When I first started going into prisons, I was teaching a Monday night Bible study at the Wing Unit in Huntsville. And did that for about 8 years. And there was a guy who came up to me. His name was Dennis. And Dennis came up and he told me a story that he ended up in prison. And he said his wife divorced him and then moved with his 2 girls to Nebraska. And so he said, I have their address and I write my daughters either, if I don't write them every week, I at least write them every other week. But at that time he said it's been 2 years and I haven't heard a thing. And I said, man, you just keep writing. I said, God sees you in that place, and you just keep letting them know you love you. Don't give up, because God will, you know. And all that you speak about faith. You speak out, you know, you're hoping and trusting God will encourage you the right way. And so over those next 8 years, at times he would get mad and not come to Bible study. And he'd come back, you know, just back and forth, and he'd be good, great at times, but he kept writing. But at times he'd say, you know, I don't even know if they're getting the letters. I don't know, maybe she's not getting it because he never heard a word back. And I kept saying to him, listen, I just know God's heart. He wants to restore those relationships. Don't give up. It had been 10 years. He walked in. You have to know this chapel in the prison. It's an old prison, so the chapel's like a cathedral. It's like 80 foot. I mean, I don't know how big 80 foot. It's huge ceilings. It's dark, gigantic. And he came in the very back. And I knew something was different. And the closer he got to me, I could see his eyes just watery. And he had this piece of paper, and he just handed it to me. I opened it up and I read it, and it said something like, I'm just, of course, paraphrasing, but basically the gist of it, Daddy, I had gone, I think he was like 18 at the time. She said, I went to some kind of youth camp during the summer with a church, and I gave my heart to the Lord. And I just want you to know I received all your letters, but I was angry with you. I didn't understand why you were gone, da-da-da-da. But she says, I want you to know that I'm very thankful that you didn't give up. And then she said, I want you to know I want to get to know you. Let's start writing each other. Now think about that. That was 10 years of writing at least twice a month, if not every week, and never hearing one word back. Now, he didn't get a return to sender, address change, anything like that. But he kept writing. And so often there are things maybe that we've done and we say, God, heal it now, put it together now. Well, we didn't get in that mess overnight. But he says, if you'll trust me, I will restore what has been devoured. And you know what? He doesn't owe us that. That's just a part of his love. His mercy, His grace. But he says, not only do I want to forgive you of your past, I want to restore to you the things that have been lost because of your past. Well then, and I'm just going to tell you this story. It's out of Genesis chapter 41. And then we'll finish up in 1 Corinthians 15. We'll make that our last passage. But in Genesis 41, it's the story of Joseph. And of course, you know, Joseph as a young boy had these visions and dreams and tells them to his family. Of course, they get jealous and upset and angry. And you know the story. He goes out to tell his brothers to come back home. His brothers catch him in that place, throw him in the pit. Next thing you know, he's being sold into slavery. Next thing you know, he's in prison. It just goes on and on and on. And I love the message by Max. I thought that was great. You know, how many times do we want to put our hands back in control of our life, and God's not doing a good job, and you know, that totally shocked me. You know, when he shared that message, I thought, how did that come out of him? But you know, going on from that place, as Joseph was in prison, there came a point when he interpreted the dreams, and he said, remember me when you get before Pharaoh. And he goes on to say, because I'm not supposed to be here. And to me what that says, he didn't quite get it. He still saw the ones that sent him to prison as being his family. Because once he got out, later he would say, you didn't send me here. God sent me here. This was necessary for me to fulfill the plan of God. But think about this. When he got out, he got lifted up, and Pharaoh gave to him one of his daughters. He had 2 children, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh was the firstborn, and Manasseh means forgetting. Listen, you'll never be able to forget your past until you have forgiven the ones that have hurt you. Now listen, sometimes it's not just forgiving somebody for things that they have done to you. Sometimes it's forgiving people for things they haven't done to you. Listen, in my life, I remember, I don't even know how, I was in my early 20s, maybe mid-20s, early 20s, when my dad first said, I love you. Listen, I knew it in my heart. I've always been the apple of my dad's eye, but he's never been able to communicate that. And I remember I was about to go on this mission trip to the Philippines, and it was back when they had just shot 5 American servicemen. It was like in the 87, 89, late 80s, beginning of the 90s, and there was a lot of chaos going on there. And I remember my dad was taking me to the airport. He wasn't going to give me a dime for this mission trip. I had to totally trust God. Can't even tell you. It was one of those, I can't even tell you the story, but the last minute, like I called the guy to say, I can't go because I don't have the last like $500. And that night somebody calls me. It was literally like that, like the last minute. I couldn't believe it. I did it. Well, now my dad had to take me to the airport. And he took me, and I can remember as I was going to get onto the plane. Back then they could walk you out to the gate. And I looked in his face, and it was like he was getting a root canal. I mean, it was like he was trying to do something and just could not do it. And then I remember he said, I love you. I'm going to tell you this. I remember that to this day. Now he said he's gotten more and more comfortable with it through the years. But when I think about that, the reason it meant so much is because I didn't realize how much I'd missed hearing it. So sometimes, listen, there are things in all of our lives that have been done to us. Through parents that didn't know any better, through people that should have been there in our corner, or whatever the case is. People that said something, and they didn't even have an idea. Some people knew what they said and intended to hurt you. I'll tell you, at some point, the only way you're going to move forward is to forgive them. Forgive them for whatever it is that they have done. And you know what Jesus said when he was on the cross? Forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And even the ones that have done things more deliberately against you, if they really knew what they were being controlled by. And I remember somebody saying this to me, and it stuck with me all my life. If you only knew where somebody else had walked, you'd be a lot slower to make a judgment about what they've done. If you'd only been in their same place, you may have reacted the same way. Listen, when those brothers came before him, he had already forgiven them in his heart. And now he was able to release that to them. But the second child's name was Ephraim. And Ephraim means fruitful. Now listen, Joseph was God, belonged to the Lord, loved the Lord, was God's favored one all the way through this journey. But there was still a part of his life that wasn't fruitful until he forgave people in his life. Just this week in prison, a guy, he's from Louisiana, been coming to Bible study for 5 years, and a really great guy. And he gave this testimony with tears this past week, and he said, He said, I was given up by my mother when I was 2 years old because of drugs. And, and so he was taken away, and he saw his mother in the same community, and even when he started to have children, had brought them to see his mother. He just never cared, you know. And I think the reality, there were all kinds of other things, but he said, if you would have asked me about my mother, I would have just said, I really don't know anything about her, and if she died today, it wouldn't affect me at all. And he said, I wouldn't have thought of myself as being bitter or angry or unforgiving. It just was the way, that's what he said, it's just, that's the way it was. She wasn't a part of my life, and I moved on and went on with my life. But he said about 4 months ago, the Lord started speaking. You do have aught. You are carrying something. And so he began a journey of got in touch with some cousins. Can you find her? Do you know where she's at? And she was in a nursing home and literally about to die. And they got her in touch with him. And he said when he talked to her, she was still hardened again. It wasn't like this great story where there was this thing, just this hardness. And he said, I almost reacted. And he said, but I knew the Lord was saying it's about your heart. And he said, Mom, I just want you to know I forgive you. And I'm sorry about everything that's happened. And you know what? There's a liberty, and I'll guarantee you from this point on, there's going to be a fruitfulness in his life beyond what he's walked before. In our lives, God's constantly wanting to make us aware. Do you have aught against somebody? Is there somebody that hurt you? Is there an offense that's been taken? As much as it depends upon you, be at peace, which means to forgive. You may not receive it in return. That's okay. It's about your heart toward that person. The last passage I want to read is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Here it is, verse 9. Paul says, for I am the least of the apostles, who am not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me did not prove vain. But I labored even more than them all, yet not I, but Christ, but the grace of God within me. Now, as I finish up with Paul's life, think about this. A lot of times, going into a prison, people talk about Joseph because he's been in prison and all this. Joseph's always kind of a hard analogy because he went to prison as an innocent man. You know what Paul says about himself? If you read Galatians 1, he says, God foreknew me even in the midst of my sin. And at the appropriate time, and at the appropriate time, we're almost done. But he says at the appropriate time. You know, think about Paul's life. In one side, you look back in the church, the religious church respected him. But once he came to Christ, can you imagine the guilt and regret that he had? Listen, think about, we talk about Stephen being stoned and Paul standing there. We don't read this, but what about Stephen's parents? I don't know if he had any siblings. What about the loss that Paul stood there and witnessed him? What about the havoc that he brought in the lives of Christians, separating fathers from their children and mothers from their family, trying to stamp out all of this stuff? And you know what? He says this. He says, I'm an apostle. I think about that. He said, I know God's calling on my life. And he didn't run from the fact. He didn't stand up and give every detail of his life and say, I did this. He said, I persecuted the church. You know what? I did some things. I am today because of God's grace. And he wasn't going to flinch back and away from God's heart to him and through him and his purpose in life. Because he'd experienced the forgiveness of God. And the last point I'll make is this, is that you know you've been healed from your past when your past becomes a tool in the hand of God. And he can use it however he wishes. And the first part of a gigantic change in my life came in prison when God told me to begin to share with the men things in my own life that related to this word instead of just giving a Bible study. As I started sharing my own personal life through the Bible study, I could see people identifying with it in the same way that I did when I went to hear a revival as a kid and a man got up and shared his testimony. And you know what he said when he started his testimony? He said, I used to never share my story because I thought it gave too much glory to the devil. And he said, then the Lord showed me I can start with the darkness and I can end in the light. Amen. Every one of us have been touched in some way by the tragedy of sin. Even as believers, and we may look at one point there where Paul talks about presumptuous sin. Of course, I'm not, I barely got out of high school, So I always thought of presumptuous were those accidental things. Presumptuous is just the opposite. It's the things that we willfully determine that we're going to do in spite of the light and the grace of God. So even as Christians, the things that we have done, he says, if we will come to the cross, he says, I have canceled out the accusations against you. If you'll simply come to the light, allow it to be owned and responsible for it, just come to the cross, I will forgive you. I will restore the things. And then he says, you are what you are because of my grace. Therefore, we do not have to live on the outskirts of faith. Which means when I pray, Lord, I really would like you to do this bit. I'm not sure if you will, not because you're not able to, because I'm not worthy of that. Well, yeah, you are. Because he's forgiven you. He's made you whole. And he says you are worthy. You are seated with Christ in heavenly places. And so if you don't have an answer at that place, it's just because either it's not time, or God's directing you, and you're just going to have to hear and trust him and surrender your will to his. But it's not because, if you've come to him in faith, because he's holding your sin against you. Because that's not his heart. Therefore, somehow there's a divine purpose in it, and we can trust him. So, that's something I was considering thinking this week just because of hearing it from a friend of mine, good friend, and it's really about the healing of his wife. It's not that I don't believe God can heal her, but because of me, I don't know that he will. How many of us live with that kind of feeling? And we don't have to. God would much rather us trust the fact that he's able and willing and does forgive us. And we can pray with a confident heart.